I am delighted to have Professor Christopher Coggins to join us at Global Asia Conversation with Scholars at Duke University. I am Julian Chen, Environmental Humanities Fellow of the Global Asia Initiative and the Franklin Humanities Institute. Dr. Coggins is the Professor of Geography and Asian Studies at the Bard College, Simon's Rock. He is the author of The Tiger and the Pangolin, Nature, Culture, and Conservation in China, which was the runner-up for the 2003 Julian Steward Award for Best Book in Environmental Ecological Anthropology, and was nominated for the Kiriyama Prize in Nonfiction. Dr. Coggins is an experienced field researcher. He has led students and the faculty on many trips to China since 1999. He is also the co-editor of Mapping Shangrila, Contested Landscapes of the Sino-Tibetan Borderlands. His work on the history of humans and tigers in China was featured on BBC Four's Natural Histories. Professor Coggins, your award-winning book, Tiger and the Pangolin, Nature, Culture, and Conservation in China, presents a fascinating story of wildlife conservation and also about biological diversity in Chinese history from ancient times to present. It is a brilliant book, but I guess most audience are not familiar with this topic of wildlife conservation in Chinese history. Do you mind first giving us an introduction about the history of nature conservation or protection in China?
Sure. On the one hand, we have early work by Nick Menzies that discusses the Mulan Weichang in northeastern China and Manchuria during the Qing dynasty. And so we know that there has been large scale nature conservation of a sort for hunting reserves. And also, there is evidence that Chinese emperors, as far back as the Han Dynasty, were also protecting areas for hunting among the royalty. But I think I'm really much more interested in really smaller scale folk and indigenous forest protection. And so, my work on feng shui forests has demonstrated fairly well that over a very large area in southern China and central China, north of the Changjiang, north of the Yangtze River, people have protected these small patches of old growth or late successional forests for a long time. And they are small, but they're also important not only for protecting the village's hydrology and crops and the landscapes, slope stability, etc., but also provide bird habitat for passerines, for perching birds. There's research going on now in Wuyuan County in northeast Jiangxi by people from the Zoological Society of London and University College specifically on the blue-crowned laughing thrush and its use of feng shui lin in feng shui forests in that area. And they don't rely exclusively on those forests, but the forests are significant parts of the habitat upon which that endangered species relies. So there are examples of a kind of folk nature conservation that has to do with protecting old growth and late successional forests in those landscapes around villages. And that certainly is done by non-Han indigenous peoples, the so-called minority nationalities as well. There's an increasing amount of data on that. And I've also done research on protected patches of forests associated with sacred landscapes in Tibetan communities out, especially in northwest Yunnan. And we know that that tradition extends across the Himalayas. In my most recent book that I co-edited with Bixia Chen on sacred forests of Asia, we have a great case study from Bhutan that has the same kinds of features, both cosmological and ecological, associated with protecting natural landscapes around Tibetan villages. Also, the values, in the tiger and the pangolin, I wrote quite a bit about how the tiger was, we could say, a sacred species for people in China historically. And I don't want to give some sort of romantic impression of that idea, but I do think that I provided a preponderance of evidence, and I think others have too. Charles Hammond's work on tiger lore in pre-modern China was one of the very important sources that I used to show that tigers were viewed as having agency. They were seen as highly intelligent, and certainly they could cause a lot of problems for people, especially when landscapes, forests were cleared, and people were more involved with landscapes that tigers were using as habitat. And people were affecting those ecosystems and certainly introducing livestock into those ecosystems and their own sort of village land use patterns. And so there were a lot of conflicts with tigers over the centuries. And I tried to document that as it is represented in the gazetteer records for 4 provinces, Jiangxi, Fujian, and Guangdong, and Hunan. And the record is remarkable. I mean, it goes back 2,000 years. I can't claim to have done this sort of extensive 县志 or 地方志 gazetteer record research on tigers that I would like to have. I would love to see someone do it for 10 provinces. But just from one library ancient books collection in Fujian Normal University, we gleaned over 500 records that is described in The Tiger and the Pangolin. And the fact that human tiger encounters could be quite deadly for humans and problematic does not negate the fact that they were taken very seriously, because the tiger was a representative of nature in an important sense. And so when there were serious tiger attacks, this was treated as a Tianming, a mandate of heaven issue. And so local officials were expected to ask for forgiveness, to pray to the city gods. People assumed that it was a political issue because nature in disorder represents governance in disorder. Problems with the government, problems with tianxia, with the way that the world is being governed by officials. And so that connection between natural phenomena and the polity is fascinating to me. And I tried to describe it insofar as it relates to humans and tigers during mostly the last millennium. I mean, you really see the incidence of tiger-human conflicts pick up around the year 1000 of the Common Era. And of course, by the beginning of the Ming Dynasty in 1368, you see, because it is the law of the land that each administrative region down to the county level is expected to keep gazetteer records. So you see a lot more records of those kinds of events. So, I provided, I think, a lot of evidence that tigers and tiger iconography symbols were seen as protective. Tiger effigy on the wall of your house, even in the 1990s in Fujian, or on the roof, a small tiger effigy or a tiger face made crudely, but kind of beautifully on the wall of a rammed earth house in a small village in Meihuashan in Fujian, was seen as a protective symbol, an apotropaic device to ward off evil. So we see this fascinating relationship in the cosmology, in Chinese cosmology, with this species. And of course, by the time Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party come to power, and they view nature in a very different way, right? Humans are to be seen in Marxian and Marxist-Leninist terms as at the center of history and as making history. And so nature needs to really serve the needs of humans and the laboring people. And so unfortunately, and I suppose this wasn't inevitable, but unfortunately, wildlife, and especially tigers, but also other so-called pest species, end up being vilified and attacked violently. And so we see this inflection point, really, I think, in the Great Leap Forward, when nature is attacked in a sort of military campaign. And certainly Judith Shapiro has documented that very well in Mao's War Against Nature. But we also see specific incidents of that in The Tiger and the Pangolin, when you see a former military officer in Fujian, in Dehua County, being called up by the government to actually lead a battle against a particular tiger in Dehua County. And so the militarization couldn't be more dramatic. They're using machine guns and grenades and things like that to kill this tiger. So it takes on this very frightening sort of voluntarist dimension where, the human will to conquer nature is also conflated with this human will to transform the world into a sort of workers' paradise, in the sense that there will be no impediments, there will be no obstructions. And it's a very frightening, very destructive vision that we see during that time.
Thank you for this very clear and illuminating overview with so many details, and it's so comprehensive. You talk about so many topics. You talk about feng shui forests, you talk about the local communities, you talk about the use of gazetteers, and you talk a lot about tigers. And these are all topics that I would like to invite you to talk in more details. So I will start with tigers, which you have already talked very extensively about. In your book, you cited the idiom in Chinese that tiger is the lord of the 100 beasts. I guess in Chinese, probably 百兽之王. And you talk about the cases of human killing tigers and the tigers attacking humans and tigers having the agencies. And there is a clear dynamic and a clear shift of perceptions, tiger killing to tiger protection and to tiger killing again, and probably to tiger conservation. Now, what do you think are the driving forces behind these changes, behind those conflicts?
What a profound question for us to ponder. I hope I can begin to give an answer. You may have noticed that in the very beginning of The Tiger and the Pangolin, I quoted a good friend of mine who is a village resident of Gonghe village in Fujian, in Meihuashan Nature Reserve. His name is Ma Shengxue, and he says, well, before the revolution, society was in disorder. And so there were tigers everywhere, and we had to constantly protect our livestock and try to drive the tigers out of the village. But then, after revolution, society became more stable. And so the tigers went away. I don't know where they went, but things were stable. And so they sort of receded into the periphery. And it's a fascinating thought. And I knew I had to put that very close to the beginning of the book because it was so striking. And of course, I put it alongside these, what I call the Pangolin Chants that I learned about in Fujian at the same time when I was doing my dissertation research in 1994 and 95. So I was so surprised to hear hunters tell me that if they hunted a pangolin, they had to say a chant to the pangolin in order to make it safer and make it more collaborative. If they were to kill the pangolin would essentially agree and it wouldn't cause the hunter any harm. And if you didn't say that chant, you would quite likely get very sick if you killed that animal, and then you would die. And they told me stories about people that happened to. So I put those quotes together. The Pangolin chant, there are many versions of it all along the Wuishan, the sort of Daimao-shan, Wuishan mountain chain. And I realized in different areas, people had different versions of it. And one version is Ni lian li, wo li lian, Ni kai shan, wo zhong tian, Ni rang wo chi ni, wo geng hui zhuan qian. And I thought, you're saying you are a pangolin, I am, and there's this nonsense word that's kind of an inversion of it, but it makes us reciprocal being. We relate to each other. You work the mountains, I work the fields. If you let me take you, kill you, then I'll be able to earn more money. And at first I thought, gosh, it almost sounds like you're making fun of this or something, this animal. Like, how does that work? But it isn't like that at all. And to answer your question, only years later, after I published The Tiger and the Pangolin in 2003, and it was only around 2006, 2007, that I started to read the literature on animism and this brilliant work that's coming out of mostly scholars from Cambridge and Viveros de Castro in association with some scholars at Cambridge, Marilyn Strathern, and also certainly Decola, the great French anthropologist, who were realizing that animism is a worldview, it's an ontology, it's a cosmological framework in which certain species other than humans have agency and power that is so great that it's a terrible risk for any human who would venture to kill them without establishing an interpersonal relationship with them. In other words, the argument is that they have a kind of personhood, but they embody differently and they embody into a different form. And so the fundamental argument is that in animistic cosmology, that humans and certain other species share a baseline of culture, a baseline of having personhood and a soul, but they are separated biologically. They take on a different form, but once upon a time they could communicate freely. That is directly contrasted with naturalism, which Decola and others, Viveros de Castro, say is the way we see the world if we're educated in science, Darwinian evolution, and in that we have continuity with animals that's only biological, but we don't share culture and we don't share a soul, or we don't share a special type of cognition that grants us a specific kind of power and agency. Therefore, they might be just completely expendable. And that's what we saw during that very ideologically pure sort of Maoist Marxist Leninism, where the non-human does not get any kind of agency. They're just sort of resource. They're like natural resource. They're kind of a thing in an almost Cartesian sense of just being meat machines that have no connection to anything divine or special. So these two very different cosmologies can have different kinds of pathways and can be taken up in human history. And so my view is that depending on the political and the cosmological and the economic discourses that are prevalent, this is what determines ideas about the soul and personhood. And so that is one thing I'm focusing on very much right now. And ecology can be very important. And I'm encouraging people to think about the oikos as the root of ecology and economy in etymological terms. So we should think about economy and ecology together from now on, because we're the species that is shaping the biomes, shaping the geochemical systems, ruining other habitats of other species. We must bring our economy and ecology together. So I think through history, this connection to tigers and other species and this granting of agency is contingent on the political and economic and cosmological forces that happen to be at play. And in ancient Chinese thought, certainly Taoism, the Daojia, the Zhuangzian and Laozian, if you will, the Lao Zhuang, encourages us to think very seriously about being one among many beings and just a small force in a whole kind of assemblage of complex forces. We are that, and our societies are that. Tianxia is a wonderful harmonizing of all these things. So at the root of Chinese cosmology, we can say this is there. We have to recognize that, but it's also easy to leave it behind, to forget about it. That's what drew me to Asian studies in the beginning, was this very powerful idea, I think.
What an in-depth answer to my question. I think you answered more than I asked. Like you said, I think it's truly important for us to consider economy in tandem with ecology and think about not just the human have agencies, but nature, animals, they also have their agencies that we should be aware of. I want to ask you about the word conservation. Many people find the idea of conservation probably only exists in modern vocabulary. And do you think conservation is a category that can be actually applied to pre-modern societies? And if so, what was the pre-modern equivalent of the word conservation in Chinese documents you have found so far?
Wow, that again is a complicated question. The root of the word conservation in modern times in the United States comes in the discursive conflict between preservation and conservation. And so by the late 1800s, the early 1900s, we have this epic debate and contest between John Muir and the transcendentalist ideology and the wilderness. This is the birth of wilderness as sacred space in the United States and in the American psyche, right? And this is what the famous environmental historian Roderick Nash writes about in Wilderness in the American Mind. And certainly William Cronin takes that up later. But the preservation impulse is a new thing coming out of Romantic thought in Europe. Conservation, associated especially with Gifford Pinchot and German forestry traditions, which James C. Scott has written about so brilliantly at the very beginning of Seeing Like a State. So conservation in our minds in the United States in this 100+ year history is about sort of wise use of resources. And they're interestingly, these two different discursive formations are wonderfully embodied, I think, at the national level, the preservationist impulse coming into being in the landscape in national parks. The conservation associated with Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt to some extent is embodied in the landscapes of the national forests. And in the national forests, of course, we see people getting concessions so that they can harvest timber and they can even have mining minerals and a lot of controlled use of resources, grazing and things like that. To apply that to China or to pre-modern societies is complicated, right? Why is it so complicated? Because of cosmos, because cosmologies are quite different, right? So I have perhaps erred on the side of saying that there was a pre-modern conservation going on, among Chinese villagers. Now, someone like George Schaller of the Wildlife Conservation Society, who's famous, for his book, The Last Panda, and has done a lot of great work in China several decades ago. He wrote me a letter about the tiger and the pangolin, and he said, I enjoyed this book, but your idea that people actually had like a conservation ethic, nah, that's not true. They didn't. I kind of resented that, but he is right in an important sense. People wouldn't have necessarily thought of natural resources at all in the way that we do as a result of this North American history. But they certainly had ideas, however they chose to express them, about sustaining resources over time and not destroying the very foundations of their livelihoods. So you could call that conservation, but you're treading on very thin ice because of the way that people actually cognize that and understand it and make sense of it. So I really like your question. And I think feng shui forests are an interesting example. And so in my recent work on the book, The Sacred Forests of Asia, that, I was a co-editor, we have 16 chapters about sacred forests from 10 different countries in Asia, 32 contributors, mostly Asian people who are field researchers, showing over and over again that the cosmology is a vehicle for protecting immediately important forests, watersheds, and local natural resources. And I don't want to be blamed for being a functionalist, just attributing these sacred landscapes to an overriding functional need to protect natural resources. But I will venture into that territory a little bit. Why? Well, because these villagers in China and in villages all over the world, they didn't necessarily have strong state support at all times. Even if the state would put up a plaque in the Ming or Qing dynasty and say, yes, we agree that no one should cut these forests in this area. And there are a lot of plaques like that. They couldn't necessarily enforce it out in the peripheries in these higher elevations, the upper reaches of watersheds, streams, and remote areas. Remember, there were no roads into many of these places. In Meihuashan in 1994-95, I worked in several villages that they didn't even have tractor roads, right? So enforcement has to have the mandate of something really powerful, more powerful than humans. And that in China becomes qi flow. It becomes your feng shui. It becomes, even if you cut that tree, that will cause the death of one male in the lineage. I learned that in one village in Jiangxi province just recently. You kill one species in the genus Phoebe, then one tree, and that will cause the death of a male member of that lineage. So, or sha zhulin, sometimes they call them kill a pig forest. If you cut one tree and we catch you, you have to sacrifice a hog for a feast for the whole village. That's a big expenditure, but you legitimate it through supernatural forces, forces that are more powerful even than forest wardens or local government officials. And Tibetans even today, will tell me our belief in God mountains and the forests that belong to them as property, that is much more powerful for Tibetans than local police or forest rangers, because Tibetans actually are concerned about these powerful forces, the mountain gods, etc.
This is a wonderful answer. And you not only answered my question about the conservation in the Chinese context, you also answered the question I was about to ask you about the feng shui forest. So thank you so much for covering the grounds on both sides. Now I want to follow up on, many of the methodologies you have talked about. So you talk about textual sources, in particular the gazetteers, the 500 gazetteers you have collected in Fujian province. And you talked extensively about your field research in various Chinese communities, various provinces. Can you tell us from your experience, what are the merits and the challenges of both methods? I know in most cases, these two types of evidence support each other and corroborate each other, but I bet there are also cases when they contradict each other. In such cases, I wonder, how do you explain and reconcile the differences from historical documents and your fieldwork?
Thank you for that question. A little backstory about my training. I was trained by a very thoughtful, very well-trained group of geographers at Louisiana State University, 3 of whom came out of the Berkeley School of Cultural Geography, meaning coming from Carl Sauer's training that spanned from the 1930s through the 70s. And he had dozens and dozens of grad students who went on to become professors at the top geography programs. And so if I hadn't had that training, I could not have done the work I did, because no one would support it. They would think I was absolutely crazy, because what I was doing was to intentionally do a lot of different things, meaning live in villages, live in rural areas, and try to learn from people and try to build really good rapport with them, as an anthropologist would do. And I came out of a program, combined geography and anthropology program, but I was also trained as a geoscientist. I have a master's degree in biogeography, and I worked with an excellent biogeographer from Hong Kong named Cambio Liu. So I learned the basics of physical geography, and especially about trees and tree taxa in China. I went toward the cultural and political end of things for my PhD. So my advisor, Stan Stevens, and later Kent Mathewson, became a co-advisor on my dissertation. They were both trained in the Berkeley School. And so in that tradition, we look for archival records, we look for historical records, but we're always in the landscape, looking at the landscape and talking to people. The 2 approaches complement each other really well, and they bring constant surprises. In 1994 and 1995, when I was doing my field research, it felt like every day was just incredibly amazing because I would learn something new. I would be walking across the mountains with an elderly man, who was still in very good shape. And he would say, "Oh, we used to burn these upland areas above the feng shui forests and above the cropping areas, above the bamboo forests that we've cultivated for many centuries. We would burn and burn." And I'd say, "Burn? Why would you burn everything up here in the high elevation?" He said, "Oh, for shanfan production." And I'd like, "Shanfan? 什么shan? 什么fan?" And he'd say, "Mountain flour." We would produce a starchy staple that we would eat, and we'd make it from juele, from fern, types of different ferns. And so they would burn the mountains, and then the bracken fern would grow much thicker and denser. And then they would harvest the roots and rhizomes of these ferns and pound them up and soak them and create this kind of flour, because they couldn't grow enough rice up at that elevation. I could hardly believe that was true. It was so strange to me. And then other people would say things like, "Yeah, we would keep the uplands clear so there'd be fewer tigers and we could hunt better, more effectively, and we could see wildlife, and we could also see bandits. People couldn't hide out and attack us from these mountain lairs. And so it was a kind of a much cleaner thing. And they also they called it lian shan, to sort of smelt or purify the mountains, and that was like a normal practice. Only when I got home and I reported to San Stevens that these people in Fujian, and they didn't only do it in Meihuashan, they did it all across this Daimao Wuishan range in different, what are now different nature reserves. I said, how could this be true? And he said, look, haven't you ever read about the Maoris in New Zealand? They did the same thing. And so who knows how old that practice is, right? This could have been happening in Taiwan and coastal China in the early Neolithic, for all we know. These things, you could only learn from a person with a long memory of land use in a specific place, right? And then, you interview a tiger hunter who's one of the last people who knows how to use a crossbow to kill tigers. And his family passed this knowledge down generation by generation, how to make the poison that you put on the metal tips of the crossbow bolts, how to set the crossbow, where to set the crossbow, how to identify tiger tracks, how to identify tiger scratches. You have to talk to people. Most people, a lot of people won't even talk to these people because they're never interested, or they just, so you learn these things from people, and then you go back. And then when you see in the gazetteer record, it will say there were tiger problems. We hired a She person who had a crossbow, and he killed the tiger, the problem tiger. And then you go, aha, the guy I just interviewed, he doesn't call himself a She person, but he lives in a house right near a She village. There's a connection. It's amazing. So you start to make these connections. Where you see that this is really strong, and where you see it's a problem if you don't try to do this, is in these really wonderful books like Mark Elvin's The Retreat of the Elephants. And I wrote a review of it for the Geographical Review. I applauded this phenomenal magnum opus. There's no question this is a kind of a foundational work in Chinese environmental history, but it misses a lot. It misses everything that's not important enough for the literati and the officials in China to record. And they missed a lot because there are a lot of things they don't want to know, that they don't want to talk about, these strange things, these strange superstitious practices, these odd Mingjian folk kinds of things that, are inappropriate from a Confucian perspective. And all of that inappropriate stuff is wonderfully rich indigenous knowledge. Who would have guessed that you could go into a village in Fujian and learn about wild boar hunting, today, or how to set leg hold traps, or make incredible snares out of bamboo, or dig pits to capture wild boar by covering these 8-foot deep pits with a thin veneer of bamboo, and then put soil on it and grow sweet potatoes and put a little bamboo fence in. The boar will jump over the fence to get to the sweet potatoes and plunge into the pit. And people were still building their own muzzle loaders and tripline guns. And I was amazed by the folk knowledge. And of course, these are the people you need to work with in the field to understand the facts about wildlife, because the people hired to work in the nature reserves, a lot of them don't even want to have to walk up on the mountain. To this day, if I want to get up and set up a camera trap in Meihuashan, I take my old friend Ma Shengshui, because he's a former hunter, and he can walk straight up the side of a mountain through thick foliage with no trail in a pair of PLA Jiefang Xie green Keds, and he can go right up. It just blows my mind. But this is the kind of people you need to work with, right?
This is really fascinating overview of your field work and how they complement and supplement the documental history written by literati. And you're so right that, there is this breakdown between literati history or Confucian history and the local knowledge. You use the words, the long memory, but what you describe is really not just the long memory of a person, but the collective memory of a village, and also generations after generations of knowledge passed down in this family of practice. The She example you have given, this is really amazing. Thank you for sharing us with this, your experience. And I think us historians, especially environmental historians, we should all learn from your experience of not just to go into the archives, but we should also go to the fields to really understand nature and understand the nature in the cultural and the societal context. So thank you. Thank you for this wonderful overview. Now I want to pick up on some of the local knowledge topic you have talked about. So much of those local knowledge are valuable in the nature conservation or the protection or living in harmony or disharmony with nature in those local villages. But I wonder how much that experience is applicable to industrial societies. Is there any way for us living outside of those villages to learn from them?
A wonderful question. I certainly would say yes, there's a lot to learn. And I think we need to learn how to focus on watersheds and the protection of watersheds through forestry, through reforestation. At the most recent workshop that Prasenjit Dwara hosted, Duke and James C. Scott was there, and Dilip Dakuna, and many people who are, I would call them luminaries in political ecology, environmental history. We're focusing on water and hydrology. And I like to think of the Asian monsoon system and the indigenous ways of living with a very wet landscape and the relationship between hydrology and carbon resources. Although my focus has been on villages that are located in the upper reaches of complex watersheds, what I call, geomorphologists call the first and second order streams way up at the headwaters, usually in higher elevations, not always. But everybody lives in some kind of watershed. Even if you're in the desert, you're in some kind of aquifer. And so we should know our watersheds. And indigenous people know their watersheds. It doesn't matter if they are hunter-gatherers or swidden shifting cultivators or sedentary cultivators or agropastoralists. They know the watershed boundaries. I've hiked up through the mountains with people in places like Meihuashan, and they'll say, oh, this is the Feng Shui Ling, the water divide. And there are good reasons for that. And they even associate qi flow with these kinds of geomorphic features. So what we can learn from this cosmological ecology, this concern with your watershed as having elements of cosmological power that if you violate, then you'll suffer retribution from a local god in the Tibetan tradition, a mountain god or Zhida, or from bad feng shui, we all will vastly benefit from protecting the forests within our watersheds at all scales. And that carbon sequestration in these systems is extremely important. And broadleaf forests are the best type of vegetation for sequestering carbon over long term and also short time scales. And so reforestation based on broadleaf trees in general. So those kinds of things are critical on a larger, and also the sort of animistic regard for animals and other species. Here's the strange thing about this, and this goes back to your older question. I would make this highly counterintuitive argument that animism is more scientific than a kind of naturalist vision in that cosmological sense, where humans are the most important kind of consciousness. What we need to do is understand from the animist cosmological sense, the fact that other beings are both sentient and they're sapient. They not only feel and experience things, but they also know things in ways we can't know them, for the very simple reason that many species can receive a stimulus from different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, either shortwave or longer wave, and they can actually process that information in ways that we cannot. Certainly we can do these things now with various scientific instrumentation, but the fact that they can experience the world in ways that are profoundly important and interesting, to me, ought to help us grant them a sort of legal standing that is emerging through the rights of nature movement. And so I say it's more scientific than we have been, because if you look at the way that, say, the rights of nature movement is trying to protect and grant personhood to water bodies and ecosystems, that may seem very strange to people. I understand that, but we do grant legal personhood to corporations. We need to start granting legal personhood to entire ecosystems to account for the multiplicity of consciousnesses, both sapient and sentient, that are within these landscapes. Those experiential events and occurrences and processes far exceed our understanding of them. In other words, there's so much going on even in 10 hectares of forests with all these beings knowing and feeling. We can't quite even imagine it, right? And we rely on it to keep our lives, our planet functioning, and our being functioning. So civilization is directly contingent on and reliant on these functioning beings. For all intents and purposes, they sort of should have personhood. We have to figure that out. This is what we can learn from indigenous practices. We really need to grant that a kind of ontological seriousness and weight as quickly as we can. So all the political battles that we're having right now, this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. We need to just keep focused on how hard this is going to be, but how critically important. And we have to have the winning argument at every step and call out the opposition because they just don't have a case.
Absolutely right. You just demonstrated that environmentalism is not just about politics, it's not just about science, but it's also about society, it's also about history. So thank you for this fascinating answer to this question. Thank you so much, Professor Coggins. Thank you for coming to Duke University's Global Asia Conversation with the Scholars. It's great to have you.
Thank you for your wonderful questions. I certainly had to think carefully. That's a lot of, those are wonderful openings into things we should all be exploring. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, have a great day.